The journey, sort of a bit of Exodus and a bit of Numbers and Deuteronomy in the next couple of weeks. The people of Israel move from slavery in Egypt out into a wilderness time, and they wander for a while, 40 years, a while. God has some lessons to teach them and some ways of shaping them along the way. And the passage that we're going to look at today is one in which God is seeking to teach them to trust him, that God will provide for them. And there's some great lessons that are to be found out there in the wilderness. And when I was looking at this passage, there is a place in which the people of Israel continue to sort of raise their complaints and say, are we even going to live? You know, kind of like, did you bring us out here to die? What a mess this is. And the way that my brain works, it made me think of a time when I was a teenager and I went with some friends to a haunted house. And not just any haunted house, but it was a 4-story haunted house in an old abandoned warehouse in Kansas City. There is a freight district, and there are these old buildings that are scary enough just kind of themselves, but they have been bought and turned into haunted houses that are very elaborate and very scary. Well, I was friends with a group of people that thought it would be fun to pay money to go get scared, and so I went along with the friends, not having ever been to one before, and it was indeed quite scary. It was unlike anything I had ever done, and I really have no intention of ever doing again. We had to make our way up all the floors of the haunted house, and then you kind of go across the top, and then you have to make your way back down all the floors again, and then out the door, and you know that you're likely to live because you paid money to do this, and they want you to go tell your friends that it was awesome, and then they would come pay money and to do it also. But there's a moment in the midst of all of this. Darkness, blinking strobe lights, and some places black lights, and all these people in costumes and fake blood and scary masks jumping out at you and recording of screams and all sorts of terrible things and gooey, ucky stuff everywhere. I remember going through it and being like, this is the worst thing I've ever done. This is awful. And even, am I going to make it out of here alive? The reality is that sometimes we have life circumstances that are not a haunted house, they're not make-believe, they aren't pretending, but they're actually pretty awful. And they're really quite scary. And we face them, and sometimes we think, am I going to make it out of here alive? It's kind of the plea of the people of Israel as they're wandering in the wilderness. They're thinking, we're really glad we're not in slavery in Egypt anymore. But here we are in the middle of a desert, and we don't even have the very basic things that we need to live. What a mess this is. Today's passage, actually, I'm going to take a kind of fly through bits and pieces of chapters 15, 16, and 17. And through there's 3 passages stacked right next to each other, where the people are without the very basic things that they need to live. And they cry out, and they complain before God. They complain to Moses, their leader, and they say, we need help, and this is not okay. We think we're going to die. And God shows up again and again and again. It's like a nice succession of God's provision showing up in their life, as if to reinforce that wherever they go, whatever they do, whatever comes ahead for them on this journey, they are not alone, and they've got a God who provides for them. Sometimes we have stories like that. God has showed up for us again and again and again. But then we get into one of those circumstances where things seem a mess again, or the ground seems shaky beneath us, or we're facing a new circumstance that is pushing us or hurting us, maybe more than anything else ever has. And we, like those Israelites, say, God, are we going to die in this? I don't know if I can survive it. Let's take a look at their story. They come through the Red Sea, which is a miraculous act in and of itself, that they are saved by walking through a sea on dry ground. They wander around in the wilderness for 3 days, and they find themselves without any water. They've used up any of the supplies that they had brought, and they were looking for a stream or a pool of some sort to provide for them, and they can't find any until they come to a place called Mara. They come to a place called Mara, and they find water, but it's not drinkable. The water, in fact, is bitter, is what the text tells us. And it's probably not just sort of like bitter to the taste, like tastes a little funky. It is probably contaminated in such a way that it would turn their stomach. It would make them totally ill. They can't drink the water there. So not only were they desperately searching for water for several days, but then when they finally find it, they can't drink it. And so they complain and cry out. They cry out to God, and then they complain to Moses, because that's what you do, right? You look to your leader, the one who's supposed to be in charge, and you say, hey, this is a mess. Can't you fix this? And then Moses does what a good leader then does, which is turns to God and says, I don't know how to fix this. I'm going to need you to fix this. And God does. God hears their complaints, and he shows Moses to take a piece of wood and throw it into the water. And when he threw that piece of wood into the water becomes sweet. The word, again, there, sweet, is just an image of radical transformation. The water maybe was something that would make them sick. They couldn't stand to drink it. It would have been horrible for them. And instead, it's made into something not just plain, but actually something extraordinary, something really good and pleasant and wonderful. So then they drink, and they refresh themselves, and they are grateful for this. And God says to them, if you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight and give heed to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will not bring upon you any diseases. You aren't going to be full of plagues like those things that happened to Egypt. In fact, I'm going to protect you, and I am the Lord who heals you. It's like just in the way that God demonstrated power by turning that sickly water into something that was good and nourishing for the soul. God is saying, I have the power of transformation. I have the power of healing. And if you follow me and you stick with me and you go my way, I can heal you too. So they continued on their journey. And amazingly, the next place that they come to is called Elim, and there are 12 springs of water. So they've gone from a place where there's no water to a place where there's contaminated water, which God then makes clean. And then they come to a place where there's an abundance of water. God is providing for them. Well, it has now been 2 months since they left home. Fast forward in the Exodus text. It's been 2 months since they have left home, and they have run out of food to eat. You see, they left Egypt, and they would have had stores of flour and oil. They could have been making bread, and they had dried things, fruits and vegetables perhaps, and they had some food with them. They left with all sorts of riches and abundance, but the gold that they have and the treasures that they took from Egypt are not going to buy them anything to eat there in the middle of the wilderness. And they can't satiate themselves on the gold that they have. They need food. And so, again, the people complain against Moses and Aaron. And they say to them, if we had only died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, at least there we sat by the flesh pots, they say. At least there we had sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out to the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. They're looking back on Egypt thinking, like, things weren't so bad there. In fact, we had plenty of good food to eat, which may or may not have been true. They're looking back in the past and thinking, well, at least that was the better place to be. And we do that sometimes. We look back and we think, well, at least that circumstance was something I could deal with. At least then I had enough. And here I am now. What do I do with the place that I'm at? Well, they're complaining and raising their concerns. They have no food. They're not complaining irrationally. They need food to eat. The Lord then says to Moses, I've got it. I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. And every day the people will go out and they'll collect enough bread for that day. And by the way, I'm going to test them in this to see if they listen to my instructions. And then on the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, there will be twice as much there for them to gather on the 6th day. God is setting up a way that he's going to provide for them and a rhythm of their life that they are to actually heed and follow. God will provide manna, bread from heaven, day after day. And they're supposed to go out and collect just enough for that day. The text kind of goes even to more specific examples. A portion for each member of your household. Don't go get double or triple portions. Don't hoard the bread. Don't get enough bread for 3 or 4 days. Just go out and get what you need to eat for that day. And then on the 6th day, you are supposed to get double because God wants to set up the practice of Sabbath, that the 7th day is kept holy and set apart, and they're not to do work on that day. So God's teaching them, even here, before he's given them the 10 commandments to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy, even here he's showing 6th day, get double the bread because you're going to rest on the 7th day. Well, this comes to pass. And Moses and Aaron go and tell all the people that this is what is going to happen. Not only are they going to have God's presence with them appearing in the cloud, but also that God has heard their complaints and he's going to provide for them. He's going to give them bread, but he's also even going to give them meat. He's going to give them quail in the evening and bread in the morning. And that you then will know that I am the Lord your God. You will know that you worship the God of the universe and that this God is your God. So in the evening, quail comes and covers the camp, which is actually quite extraordinary. Again, a sign of God's abundance, not God just meeting their very basic needs, but God giving them something beautiful and wild because people didn't eat meat every day. At this time, in this culture, meat would have been reserved for special occasions, maybe once a week on a feast day. Maybe at a great celebration, a wedding banquet or a holiday or a birthday or something you're celebrating, but meat was not a part of the daily diet. So God is not only providing them their daily staple of bread, but then going one step further even and giving them meat to eat each evening. The bread, we find out in the evening, or in the morning, there's a layer of dew on the grass, and then when that lifts, the surface of the wilderness is covered with a fine, flaky substance like frost on the ground. Kind of hard to imagine in the middle of September, but think back. You know those mornings that are cool and crisp, and it's like the grass has a little icy frost, and it's kind of silver sheen across it? That's what it looked like when they went out and the manna was on the ground. They're confused when they first see it. They say, "What is it?" For they didn't know what it was. And Moses then says, "That's the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." And God's saying, "Go gather what you need, amount for each person in your household." I'm struck by the fact that they don't recognize the bread when it's given to them. It's somehow different. It doesn't look like a loaf sitting there in the grass. It's a different substance or texture or something. And they have to be told that that's what it is, that this is the bread that God is providing for you. Yet I realize that happens in my own life a lot of the times. I tell God, I have a particular need. God, I need you to help me out with A, B, and C. And then when X, Y, and Z shows up in my midst, where God has done something different or offered me something that I don't quite recognize, I think, well, God, have you heard my prayers? Are you going to help me? It's like the blessing that shows up. I might look at it and say, well, what is that? God would say, hey, I answered your prayers, and it looks a little different than you think, but I've provided for you. In the same way for them. So they go out and they collect the bread and they bring it in, and yet there are people certainly that don't follow the instructions. Some decide that they're not really sure about this whole bread is going to come every morning thing, so they gather way more than they should have. They gather more than their whole household needs, and they store it away in their tents. And they're thinking that they're going to hoard that bread and they're going to be taken care of. If God doesn't show up the next day, it's okay, I got it. I took care of covering myself. Sometimes we do that too. But the thing is, the bread that they hoard away rots. It turns into, it becomes foul and it bred worms, which is disgusting. It becomes nasty and inedible. It becomes, it's like God says, don't you see? I asked you to trust me each day with just enough for that day. And if you're going to take matters into your own hands, it's not going to go well for you. There are also people who don't understand the whole Sabbath thing. They come to the sixth day and they're like, oh yeah, God keeps showing up with the bread every day. And so on the sixth day, they don't heed the warning to get twice as much on that one day so that they might rest on the Sabbath. And then they end up on the Sabbath with no food to eat. Honoring the Sabbath can be like that in our lives too. Sometimes we think, how important is it to take a day set aside to the Lord to rest and to worship? I'm strong. I can do work and keep pushing all day, every day. I don't have time to slow down. I don't have time for this sort of take a day of rest kind of thing. I've got things to do. And when we push on past that, the reality is it turns like that moldy, wormy bread. Sometimes we get so exhausted that we're actually not worth a whole lot. Sometimes by ignoring the rhythm that God has given to us and asked for us, we create a mess of our own doing. I was sharing that sometimes I find I practice Sabbath from midday Friday to midday Saturday, a 24-hour period there. And yet sometimes I come to that kind of Friday afternoon, Friday evening, and I think, I really need to make this call. I really need to do this thing. I really need to check this email. I really need to go ahead and send this thing. And actually, it's just easier to do it now while I'm remembering, because I might forget if I wait till the next day. And so I open my computer and I get on there. I know it's my Sabbath, but I'm going to just take care of this real quick, God. And then like 2 hours later, I've gotten caught up in all sorts of stuff, reading things and sending things and doing all sorts of work. And then I come to the end of that day and I think, well, I did not rested at all. And God probably looks at me and is like, I told you how this works. God has given them a rhythm and asks them to live into it. And if they do, they will find life that is good. God has given a rhythm to our lives of trusting him. And if we will trust him, it is good. And he will care for us. Well, there's one more passage that comes on the heels of this. And just briefly, it's a passage where they come again to a place with no water. So they've been taken care of, their needs have been met, bitter water is turned sweet. Then they have no food, and the bread comes from heaven, and quail is provided for them. They come to another place where, once again, there is no water. They've wandered around, and they get there, and no water. So the people then actually even start arguing with themselves and with Moses. And they're like, come on, we don't have water to drink. We need water. Once again, did you bring us out here to die? We should have stayed in Egypt. Now we're going to die of thirst. And so then Moses goes to the Lord, and Moses says, why have you made me leader of these people? Why is it that they don't trust you? Why are they complaining? Haven't they seen? Don't they know? So Moses then is the one that's actually complaining before God. He says, God, we need you. And once again, God says, okay, I got this. God says, go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders. You're going to go to a place called Horeb. And when you stand there, take that staff that you used to strike the Nile, the same staff that you held out over the waters to part the sea. Take that staff and hit the rock that you come to at Horeb. And he does. And then water springs out of the rock. And there's plenty of water for the people to drink there in that place. God shows up again and again and again. He hears their complaints. He hears their struggles. He hears their sorrow. He hears of their need. And he answers. Not exactly the way that they were looking for. But God meets their needs and provides for them again and again and again. It is as if to story these people, the Israelites, to believe and trust in the care of God. And I think it's here for us, so as to story us as God's people, to believe and trust in the care of God. God provides for us too, again and again and again and again. There should be no doubt. We should be able to see God's faithfulness in the past and not fear for our situations in the future. Professor of Old Testament Beth Tanner writes that this is a story that reminds us that God also calls us out of that which enslaves us. And God calls us out of the things that enslave us to a life that is dependent upon God. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. In fact, like the Israelites, our path will be full of trials. And there will be times that we are tempted to depend upon things and persons other than God. In fact, many times we find that it is easiest to try to depend on ourselves and that which we can make come to pass before we depend on God. But this is a story that reminds us that God can be trusted, that there is enough and that we are not alone. And so if you find yourself in a season of wilderness, where you're wandering around and you don't really know where things are, you don't know where you're going and what comes next on the path, you're facing circumstances that seem too challenging to endure, or you think even like them, I am going to die. You have a God that says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. You have a Lord who inspired the words that say, through Christ, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. There is nothing that you will face in whatever wilderness you find yourself in which God will not hear your cry and come to your aid and provide for your every need. We serve a good God indeed. Will you pray with me? Holy Lord, we are grateful for the ways that you show up in our life and you carry us and you care for us. Many of us don't find ourselves wanting for bread and for water.